Hello horror hounds, welcome back to my A to Z of horror. We're travelling back to 1980 and we're just on the cusp of the slasher movie explosion with a really smart psychological thriller type horror movie that deals with the movies themselves and how people can become obsessed with them. Way before Scream, there was Fade to Black. As ever, I need to acknowledge for inspiration Jambo Shango and Randy Mole and their channel and their A to Z of horror, and I will be linking in the description field below to their entry for F, which is Freddy versus Jason. But for me, we're going to be looking at Fade to Black, a movie that I've had in my collection for a while and specifically used this A to Z of horror series to pull it down from the shelf and actually watch it. Mentally, I put it alongside, Popcorn, which is another sort of horror movie about horror movies. In particular, in Popcorn, the sort of gimmicky William Castle type movies. And little did I know that Fade to Black has, because I'd have watched it a hell of a lot sooner if I'd have known, Fade to Black has a lot more in common with George Romero's Martin. I think it's fair to call Fade to Black another revenge fantasy movie. Entry for E, Evil Speak, was a sort of satanic revenge fantasy movie that I did not like. Fade to Black is absolutely a cut above the rest, but like Evil Speak, like Martin, in a way like Taxi Driver, it follows a disaffected young man who descends into his own obsessions, and his obsessions eventually fuel his violence and murder. I guess it does help to be a movie buff yourself when you're watching Fade to Black. The movie tends to pay you dividends if you can get the references. It feels almost like a weird sort of reward system. If you live and breathe movies like Eric does in this film, you can't help but align yourself with him. He is a sympathetic villain in the mould of Martin, in the mould of Norman Bates. All three of those performances, I think it's no coincidence that they're not alpha male characters. They're all three of them are much more feminine. We get to see their weaknesses and their lack of armor, for want of a better word, social armor. All three of those characters descend into their own internal fantasies, which ultimately become deadly. So whilst you, as a movie fanatic, understand Eric, you have an uneasy alliance with the film. The film's clearly made for people like you, by people like you, who love the movies and love the history of the movies and love movie trivia, and there are references to the movies throughout, visual references, dialogue references, clips. It comes with a sort of contract that forces you to acknowledge the potentially negative aspects of that kind of obsession of living in a fantasy world, of finding comfort in it. It's strange. In my video for Evil Speak, I acknowledged how people can come to the horror genre from an unhappy place in their life or youth and find comfort with the characters and the events on the screen. And here we have yet another movie which acknowledges that head on, but at the same time forces you to acknowledge the potentially negative aspects of that. It's a tragic decline, and the movie is a tragedy. At first you can see him wearing these movie characters, the James Cagney tough guy, Cody Jarrett, as a form of being able to cope with the world and the people who are pushing him down and pushing at him and just picking, bullying, pressing. He thinks that if he's more like Cody, he can deal with them more. If he's the gangster, tough guy, then no one will push him around because Cody Jarrett doesn't take any shit, so why should Eric Binford? But when it becomes a crutch, and then when it becomes sort of the fantasy world enabling of his revenge fantasies, it tips over into a full-blown, I wouldn't even call it a murder rampage, because the first couple of murders you could argue are sort of almost accidental. I don't want to give away too many details of the film because I feel that very few people, I don't see many people talking about it, so I feel that very few people have seen it. You can see it here on YouTube, so I don't want to spoil anything. Eric Binford is played by Dennis Christopher, who most of us horror hounds will know as Eddie Kaspbrak in the TV movie version of It, the Tim Curry It. He plays the adult version of Eddie, you know, the one with the inhaler and the domineering mother. He has a real Roddy McDowall quality to him in most of his performances, but especially here in Fade to Black. As a lifelong avowed fan of Roddy McDowall, I think the man's an absolute genius. I love everything he does. The mixture of sort of fragile, fluttery exterior, but with a hard centre. If you push too hard, there's an immovable core at it, is something that's fascinating to watch. Anyone who has that sort of Roddy McDowall aspect to a performance or a character will instantly get my attention. This isn't a particularly overtly violent movie. It's not an overtly bloody movie. It's much more of a psychological portrayal of a mind in descent, descending into fantasy. It might even be a stretch to call it a horror movie, even though it touches upon imagery of an awful lot of horror movies. It's not just horror movies, it's old Jimmy Cagney gangster movies as well, Cary Grant movies, film noir and stuff like that. But it certainly helps if you have a passing knowledge. It doesn't have to be encyclopedic. The film does join the dots of the more important films it's referencing for you, but a passing knowledge of Kiss of Death, White Heat, I guess Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Bela Lugosi's Dracula, Psycho. To be honest, there's a shower scene, and as soon as the shower scene starts, the film, as knowing as it is, begins to reference Psycho. I mean, how could you not? But with a weird kind of mashup. It's Psycho, but Eric as Bela Lugosi entering the shower room as Dracula rather than Norman Bates, and a very wry joke at the end. He's not approaching the shower stall with a knife, but with a pen, because he wants the woman's autograph. I mean, he's obsessed with this woman who's a wannabe actress who looks like Marilyn Monroe, so her sort of blurring, and her name is Marilyn, so her looking like Marilyn Monroe, being called Marilyn, really doesn't help him define real and fantasy. But he drops the pen in the shower, and the last shot is the ink from his pen running down the plug hole, and that's a really black humorous joke to anyone in the know who knows that Hitchcock used ink to stand in for blood in the shower scene as it drained away, so it showed up nice and black. So it's one of those movies that that rewards you for this kind of obsessive level of movie trivia knowledge, but at the same time kind of says, just that in your life, possibly not the healthiest thing you can have. An awful lot of this kind of subtext is put solely in the B plot, which is almost entirely extraneous from the movie. We follow, when we're not with Eric, we follow a psychologist recently assigned to the local police department. He's played by Tim Thomerson, who's much better known as Jack Death in the Trancers movies. And he's sort of portrayed, this psychologist, as an ex-hippie, lefty, soft on crime, absolutely despised by the tough on crime captain of the police precinct, put into the mouth of this psychologist is on one level this idea that the film does adequately well of itself of portraying Eric as the victim, and at the same time this weird sort of very conservative stance that says that it's the violent movies today that are making kids violent. And I guess the irony being that the movies that fuel Eric's fantasies aren't the violent movies of the day. He draws upon the movies from the 30s, 40s and 50s to fuel his violent fantasies. So I'm assuming that the movie is sort of undercutting that and not proposing that as a genuine argument. Violent movies make people more violent. I think Fade to Black would probably stand more with the thesis of Scream, that violent movies don't make killers. Violent movies make killers more inventive. The movie jumps around a bit towards the end. You're not entirely sure how much of this is really playing out and how much of it is in Eric's head. And I don't mean that in a good way. I mean that in a kind of, have they lost a couple of scenes out of this way? The A plot and the B plot have nothing to do with each other until the final reel, when they have to smash together. And there's some off-screen leaps of logic that bring the police onto Eric's trail that aren't ever entirely made clear. Neither is Eric's endgame, really. He sets up a situation where he and Marilyn are to recreate a scene from a Marilyn Monroe movie, but at the same time there's a couple of shots in that scene which scream Peeping Tom to me, so you're left completely unaware as to what his intentions towards Marilyn are. It's not intentionally ambiguous. The focus that the first first three quarters of the movie have on the psychology of this do get frayed and fall apart. It's almost as if the movie goes, oh Jesus, it's that time, well, we better wrap this up. So whilst perhaps not entirely a horror film, you can watch Fade to Black here on YouTube. I will link to that again in the description field below. Anyone who's a fan of the history of movies, anyone who loves the self-referentiality of Scream, anyone who loves George Romero's Martin or Taxi Driver should definitely check out Fade to Black. And if you're a big Scream fan, once you've watched Fade to Black, you will probably, like me, think, really, over the course of 4 Scream movies, no one, especially Randy, could mention Eric Binford or Fade to Black? I think a slight mention of this movie in Scream not only would have worked amazingly well in Scream, but it would have raised the profile of this movie, and more people would see it. More people should see it. So that was F. Next time for G, we're going to be looking at, well, I'll leave a visual clue at the end of this video like I always do, and hopefully that's not going to be hammering home the point. We'll find out next time that G is for